Thank you everyone for joining. This is the FPP Advanced Topics class. We just came from the basic player class. I am in the process of making a few changes to prepare for this class, so I'll just kind of talk through before we start the slide deck. I'm just about where I need to be for this, but so bear with me just a moment as we finish this last minute config change. We'll get into the specifics we're going to talk about, but I do want to mention that things we're going to talk about in this class are options and things that are available within FPP. You don't need to do any of these specific things to have a successful show, but it's just a way of extending and bringing other features and functions into your show if you so choose. So everything we're going to talk about today is optional, but certainly still very doable and can bring some additional elements to your show. So this needs to go to SN1 and apply. I believe everything should be about ready. I want to switch back over here. Let me get and we're kind of running back-to-back classes today, so I apologize for the minor delay and getting started, but we're just about there. I had asked if we could have a small break between classes, but just the way the scheduling lays out didn't really work that way, which is fine. Presentation helps if I start the correct presentation instead of the other one. Zoom share. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. So this is the FPP Advanced Topics class. So again, everybody welcome. I'm pretty sure my other controller is now reachable. I haven't checked that yet, but it says it is, so it should be good. And I'm going to switch my X-Lights show directory to be the correct show directory for this demos that we're going to do, FPP Class Advanced. And this is the last little quick change. You're getting a little bit of view behind the scenes before we get started in actual talking, so apologize for that. But cool. So in advanced topics, so what are we going to kind of hit today? So the primary milestones that we're going to try to hit in this class today are going to be talking about doing a quote separate show network mode. And when you set up a separate show network, that's rarely really required, but a tremendous number of people seem to think it is, and they commonly will set up a separate show network, which is fine because it's an extremely valid topology. But in order for your X-Lights computer to access your controllers around that separate show network, there's two methods usually deployed that we'll talk about today. The proxy configuration method, using a proxy service on the FPP device, which will connect the two networks, or a routed configuration where you actually have to manually configure static route so that your PC that's normally on your home network side would be able to route through the PI to connect to the show network. We will really talk mostly about proxy configuration just for the sake of brevity in this meeting. We will also talk about GPIO outputs, like configuring devices to be triggered by a GPIO output, such as to drive like a relay. So you can configure a relay and you can trigger that relay to trigger using a GPIO output. We'll talk a little bit about command presets in FPP. For those who've been around FPP for a long time, back in FPP 4 days, we had a feature called events. And in 5, with the UI and all the improvements that came in FPP 5, that events transition in what we know as command presets. And even in the current version of FPP, which is 7, as of this recording, there's some other advancements around command presets and how to trigger those from X-Lights. We'll talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk about GPIO inputs, like buttons and triggers, and how do I have a button or a trigger that can perform an action. That's going to be a GPIO input. So we'll use a button to input into FPP in order to run commands. That's the short answer. Talk a little bit about the plugins, and specifically we're going to demo like the big button plugin. So there's a plugin options. When you get that area, we'll talk about how you can extend functionality of FPP and other developers can write plugins because there's a whole framework in place to be able to extend the functionality from other developers. We're just going to kick right into it. So who is this guy talking, right? So I'm Ron Armstrong. For those who were in the class earlier, this is old news, but I'm from the Kansas City, Missouri area, right in the middle of the country. And I've been doing animated LED shows with X-Lights and FPP and stuff since around 2018. So I got about 5 years under my belt. I've been fortunate enough to be part of the FPP QA team for the last several years. So working since the beginning of 6 as we were transitioning from 5 to 6 and all the way up to current. And I'm also a founding member of the Matos Designs M team. With Matos Designs, we now have a consulting services team that if you need any consulting services, you reach out. And where I do most of my work, or a lot of my work, is I'm also a very active X-Light Zoom room helper for about 3 years now. I'll spend 1,000 to 2,000 hours probably in that active Zoom room. I'm an empty nester, so I've got extra time usually. And I've helped with shows all across the world. In my day job, when I have time for the day job, right? I'm basically an enterprise IT storage management consultant. I work for a large enterprise storage company, and data center architect is my kind of background. So all things networking, server storage, virtualization, et al. Quick little fun fact, I also happen to be an amateur radio operator. Not a lot of people know that, but I participate in some disaster relief exercises as well as other local charity little charity events around my area, and leverage my amateur radio operating skills for some of that. So kind of fun thing. Got many other hobbies too, cars, motorcycles, etc. Talk a little bit about the class diagram real quick and just kind of get a visual of some of the things we're going to talk about today. So over on the left-hand side, I kind of have what my network is currently set up as. I just made some changes from my previous class, so this might look a little bit familiar. But essentially, I've got like a Wi-Fi router. It's going to be just presented as your home Wi-Fi router, like you would have like in every home. My X-Lights computer is wirelessly connected. Today, I happen to be remote. I'm not at my house, so I'm actually communicating from my X-Lights computer over VPN to this Wi-Fi router. And attached to that Wi-Fi router is a network switch. As of right now, the only thing plugged into that switch is my main Pi player. And it's a Pi player is directly plugged into the switch. In this slide, and we're not going to go into great detail on that, I actually have 2 different separate show network setups. Right. So on the left side over here, I've got this Pi called Test Pi 3 that is wirelessly connected to this Wi-Fi router. And he has a separate show network configured for him that's talking to a Falcon, which I have a string of pixels and a couple of floods. I've got a DMX flood off the DMX port, RGBW flood, and some string of pixels. And I have a second, so this is just a demonstration how you can have multiple separate show networks. It's not very common, but there may be use cases where that exists. We're going to talk in this class specifically just about one separate show network. Back on this Test Pi 3 on the left-hand side, I call this the 103 network, talking to the Falcon. And for where my Dragon is connected to this Test Pi 4, this is a 101 show network. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get to it. And I still have this Pi 0 that's wirelessly connected that's driving my P10 panel. So this is just direct, no separate show networking, just the player would send multi-sync commands to each of these Pis. And each of these 3 Pis will be set up in remote mode to receive those multi-sync commands, and then they will do active mode outputting to the Dragon. That's where we're going to focus for today. Now for the other GPIO part of the configuration, just kind of get a quick visual of what that looks like, and we'll refer to part of this documentation later as well. So this Test Pi 3 happens to be the one I have all my GPIO stuff configured on. So I got this Test Pi 3 operating remote mode here that's wirelessly connected to the wireless router. I happen to have an Experience Lights input hat. This happens to not currently not be the in and out board because I had to pull my in and out board and send it to a show. So it actually got deployed. So I'm using just the earlier input extender hat that's plugged onto the GPIO pins of the Pi. And then it goes over to what they call their extender node, which in this case, I have RF relays. I've got a little RF key fob the RF key fob that triggers these 4 relays I'm using as buttons. So instead of using a traditional push button like you may have seen in a lot of setups, in this scenario, I'm using like a little key fob that triggers these relays, which just function as 4 different buttons. These happen to be configured to be input 1, 3, 4, and 5. And then on the hat, you can see the GPIO numbers for 1, 3, 4, and 5. That's what we're going to configure later. Just a little bit about the physical setup. Now, one nice thing about the Experience Lights hats for input control is they have a header extension. And so I have this just breakout header extension plugged on top. And then I'm connecting to this triggered relay for a GPIO output. So that's on a different GPIO pin that's going to be outputting to a relay, which is going to control this little amber LED light. So that's the gist of the physical setup, right? So let's just jump right into the separate show networking setup. So this diagram is straight out of the FPP manual. There is an FPP manual. If you're in FPP, you want to go there, go here. If you go to help, and then FPP manual, I'll restart that and see if it actually communicates to the Dragon or if I messed up on my reconfiguration. It may have messed up on my reconfiguration. Yeah. Okay, but anyway, help and then FPP manual. That's going to take you to the current version of the manual. And I will, oh, I know why that's doing that. So I'm going to clear that. That was something I didn't get cleared out from the previous class. In the tail end of the manual, down around page 162 or so of the current, this is the FPP 6 manual. The 7 manual is not currently released. I know Rick and team are working very hard on updating the FPP manual. There's a whole area on common network setups. And so you talk about this is standalone mode, which is not connected to anything else. There's home network mode without a switch or with a switch. And then there's separate show network mode, separate show network. And we're kind of just stole this graphic from down here, separate show network with the switch, which kind of depicts the setup that we currently have. Right. So I stole this slide from the FPP manual because that might be a visual clue later if you're looking in the manual. So in the gist, we end up with 2 different networks, right? So the left-hand side is going to be your home network router with your X-Sites computer. Everything in green is going to be one network. The FPP device, in this case, it's a Raspberry Pi, is going to be wirelessly connected up. Typically, it can be wired as well, but he's going to be the communication gateway between the 2 different networks. So everything in the red, in my scenario, I've got like a singular Dragon over here or a singular F16 because I'm actually got 2 different show networks, not to complicate things, but actually set that up for a customer. So that's why we did that drawing. And the FPP device is going to function as a communication gateway. And there's 2 methods primarily to how to allow your X-Sites computer to access your controllers. So in the proxy method, this is usually the simplest to configure because it's all configured in X-Sites and FPP. And there's no advanced network routing or anything you have to do. And it is supported by most modern controllers. So there are some controllers out there that may not work 100% when using the proxy method because it implements a proxy service. And just this past couple of weeks, as an example, because we were chatting about this earlier, Joe Hinkle and the Hinks picks actually did a firmware update on the Hinks picks, and it now does function quite well as a proxy configured separate show network. It did not used to, but he did make some new firmware updates. So make sure on firmware update 132 if you're a Hinks picks user. But like Falcons, Genius, Dragons from Matos, those all work just well behind proxy and easiest method. If you happen to have a controller that doesn't support the proxy method, then if you want to have direct access to that controller, you're going to have to use a routing method. And in order to do that, you're going to have to configure a static route either on your PC or on your home router. Now, some home routers don't allow you to add static routes. It would be best if you could do it on your home router, but if that's not feasible, you would do it on your home PC. If it's a Mac, that's even more complex to add a persistent static route on a Mac, which is why the proxy method came to be and why it's typically preferred. Housekeeping. Obviously, if you have questions, feel free to post in chat. And there are other helpers and moderators in here that can help answer that. And we'll have a question and answer section at the end, provided I don't run out of time. So let's go ahead and demonstrate and show kind of what I have set up here. So if you were in the earlier class, I've got my standard Dragon controller. He's now a different IP address. I am going to go ahead and clear it out. Apologize for my main player. This Dragon is no longer at this address because we removed it. So this is my main player that is not going to be outputting anything. So I actually need to clear this output config. So now my main player has no output. We'll come back and talk about that in a second. So the Dragon should now be at the address 192.168.101. You'll notice that it's not in the 30 network anymore. It's in 101. So this is should be the actual address of the Dragon. Actually, I haven't checked it yet because I just changed things over, right? But that should be. And then he's going to be front-ended by this proxy FPP device in our drawing. That's what we call test pi 4. And he's at this address of 30.170. I need to minimize some things here. Yep, 30.170. Perfect. Came over the same address. And then I have the test pi 3, which if we refer back to our drawing, was directly connected, and he only lives here because we're going to use a single channel on that guy to fire that relay and light up that yellow light. He would not normally need to be defined as a controller, but since we have him as a controller to control that relay and that single channel, he is defined as a controller as well. And then my Falcon is set up similarly, where he's 103.147 and the proxy is 30.104. The proxy is going to be the Wi-Fi address side of the Pi. I'm going to flip back to the other network drawing here. So remember, the XI's computer is going to talk to the Falcon through the Wi-Fi side of the Pi. So the proxy is going to be the Wi-Fi side of the Pi. And then your Falcon is going to be the actual show network IP. And the same for the test pi 4. The XI's computer and the main player are going to talk to the Wi-Fi side of the proxy host FPP device, in this case test pi 4, and he's going to output to the Dragon. So that's a little gist of that setup. To configure proxy and X-Sites, you just have to define this category called FPP proxy IP host name. You have to have the IP address for the Wi-Fi side of the FPP instance. And your little tool tip right there actually says that. This is typically the Wi-Fi IP of an FPP instance that bridges the two networks. Within FPP, and since I'm on test pi 4 here, this is the guy that should be talking to the Dragon. His channel output is trying to send to the Dragon. I'm just going to hit ping over here just to make sure this is working, since I'm doing these classes back to back and I did have to make network changes between classes. That was successful. So I am successfully communicating from test pi 4, which is our proxy host, to the Dragon. The step in FPP in order to configure proxy is going to be under status control, proxy settings. 101.102 is his IP address. So under proxy settings, we need to make sure and add a proxied host and put the IP address of the controller in here and hit save. So there's two parts to the setup. In X-Lights, you configure the FPP proxy IP address, which is the Wi-Fi side address, 30.170 in this scenario. And then you have to come into FPP and add the proxied host 101.102 and then save that. That's the actual IP address of the controller. So if I click this link right here, this is a shortcut to take me directly to that proxied controller. So we should be looking at the Dragon configuration page here. And just, I'll bring your attention to the address bar in the browser. So this address bar is not going directly, right? I'm going to the Wi-Fi address of the Pi /proxy / actual IP address of the Dragon controller. So we are now communicating to this Dragon controller through the FPP proxy. Hopefully that is fairly clear. I'm going to go back on that tab just to get back to that other FPP4, the test Pi 4 instance. Go back to status page. So that's the gist about how to configure proxy setup with the separate show network. A lot of material out there. If you want real details, feel free to come back into the X-Sites Zoom room if you get really stuck. We'll be able to help you out. So talk a little bit about GPIO outputs. So I got a little snippet out here from our diagram. You remember I'm using a GPIO output to drive this relay board. Now this is an opto-isolated low voltage triggered relay. The GPIO pins are going to be either set to high or set to low. They're only 3.3 volt when they're set to high. So you want to be very careful connecting things directly to GPIO pins. By using an opto-isolated relay, then the relay voltage is not, it's going to be very unlikely that you accidentally get that relay voltage to the GPIO pin because it's optically isolated. Just be very careful when you're accessing the GPIO pins directly because you can physically permanently damage. Switch them. I think my speaker don't want. Okay, it's all changed back. Sorry about skipping forward there. Batteries are running low. Everybody can still hear me? Is that right, Pat?
Yep.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So I am powering the relay in this case from a 12-volt power supply because my connected load, in this case, this yellow amber light, is a 12-volt DC light. So I got 12-volt input to the relay. And in this case, I'm using the same power supply that's powering the Pi. But you do want to make sure that the negative side or the V minus, if you are using a separate power supply, that those are somehow connected electrically, just the V minus only. Therefore, you have a common reference point for the negative side. Right. I happen to choose an available GPIO pin, so I chose GPIO 4, which happens to be on pin 7 to drive the relay. We can then trigger an FPP command called GPIO to set that GPIO pin high, which should trigger the relay, or set it low, which should deactivate the relay. Right? We can also go in and assign an other output within FPP with a channel number from X-Lights, so we can actually trigger that relay from X-Lights. So we can make the relay go on and off, on and off, on and off. And because sometimes a FPP command takes parameters, and sometimes it's difficult to remember exactly which parameter, it can also use command presets that we'll talk about next. We'll use command presets so that we'll just create a preset name. In my case, we'll have amber on, amber off that actually does the command for us. So for the rest of the presentation, we could just talk about those English commands as opposed to remembering all of the other options, right? So let me go back to my multi-sync here real quick and get to test by 3 because I don't really recall his IP address right away. So I'm just going to go here, right click, open in a new tab, and I should be looking at test by 3. Cool. So this is the device that has all the GPIOs configured. So down here at the bottom, we can always run a random command, right? So we're going to run a random command, and I'm going to choose the command just called GPIO. And I have to pick which pin number. Now I'll call out that this is the physical pin location, not the GPIO number. I have example, I've got this GPIO breakout guide over here. So I know that GPIO 4, this is kind of small text. You can see GPIO 4 happens to be pin number 7. Right, so it's pin number 7 equals GPIO 4. That's the one I chose to use for my relay. So I want to set this to pin 7. And I got a choice of on or off. So I'm going to flip back because I am a demonstration guide to my live camera view. And oh, it must be lunchtime because I've got my lunch lights running there. So I apologize about that. Let me, I'll just let those run. So these lights that are currently lit up are just part of my everyday lunchtime / dinner time lights. I've got a schedule running 24/7, 365 because I work at home. Sometimes I forget to eat lunch. So I have like a little command. I've got lights around the house that light up at noon saying, hey, that means it's lunchtime. Kind of cool. But right in this mess over here on the table over here, I've got a bright yellow LED that we're going to light up here in a little bit, and you'll be able to see that bright yellow. So we're going to set this to on and say run now. And remember, this camera is a little bit delayed because I am going over the internet. So if this works properly, that bright yellow light just turned on, right? So this camera is delayed. So it doesn't take that long to actually trigger. It's just because I'm working remotely over a VPN and this camera is delayed. So I got that bright yellow light because I just turned that on. I'm going to clear this on and say run now. And if I look over there, that light should turn off here in a little bit, right? So now we are successfully triggering the FPP command called GPIO to pin 7, which happens to have driven that. I went back to my presentation here. That light is attached to the relay. So I'm using GPIO 4 triggering the relay, which is lighting that light. Cool. GPIO outputs. So the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about command presets and what are command presets, and then we'll kind of demo that too. So a command preset is just a way to call an FPP command with all predefined parameters. That way you don't need to remember all the parameters. You can set up a command preset. Also, it's really leveraged for a couple of other things where we can use a predefined trigger to run commands as well. So we'll show you some of those predefined triggers. And one is called FPPD started. So every time FPPD starts, it's going to run the command that you configure, such as play playlist. So in the earlier days, we might have done like a 24-hour schedule where we set the schedule up for start at midnight, end at midnight kind of thing to try to, that way when you plug the Pi in, the FPP instance, when you plug it in, it'll automatically start something. But now we have these triggers that we can configure much easier. So we can configure a command preset, FPPD started, and the command can be play playlist Zoom class. And then as soon as you apply power, it'll automatically start that and loop it forever until you unplug power. So if you're doing like a standalone prop or something out in the woods or something that's remote, and you just want to say power it up and have it play and continue to play until I unpower it, you can use this command preset called FPPD started. Working with command presets, you can also define now in modern versions of FPP, like FPP 7 specifically. You can do this in earlier versions, but the technique has changed. So we'll talk just about current because there's lots of material about older versions. So this is 2023. We're talking about FPP 7. So you can define a control channel output in your FPP settings that you can use to trigger a command preset when you pass it a certain value. So by that, you can have a channel, say 9152, and when 9152 channel receives a value of 10, run this command. And then in X-Lights, you could configure a single channel model, make sure he's the correct address, whatever that address is, 9152 we just spoke about, and then use an on effect and set the brightness at 10, and that will send the value of 10 to that channel, which will be received by FPP, and it will execute that FPP command associated with that preset. We'll walk through that a little bit, but that's kind of an advanced topic, not something that everybody's going to need to do. But again, with that advancements in FPP 7 and modern X-Lights, they made that even easier. Instead of having to work with that control channel and the value and send the right value to trigger the right command on the right channel, you can actually create now a specific timing track to call command presets directly within your FSEQ. if you configure that in your Excite sequence, right? So you can go to your Excite sequence, you can generate a timing track for FPP commands, and then you can type in your commands like you would for a state timing track where you put in the name of the state that you want to trigger, or like a lyric track where you put in the words. And that will not trigger if you just play the sequence from Xlights, but once you save that sequence and upload it to FPP, when FPP plays, it will trigger that sequence. Pretty sure I wanted to go in and take a look at some of that, right? So back in our FPP live instance, to see your command presets is going to be under status control and then command presets. So in this instance, I've created 2 command presets. I've named it Amber On. And if I edit that, all that's doing is calling that GPIO command and pin 7 and turning it on. Right, just like we did manually. I just created a command preset so I don't have to remember what pin number, right? And I created an Amber Off that I then edit and say that's going to be pin 7 without the check mark. So if I say run now here, that should turn my yellow light on, and I can see the yellow light's on. If I double back and say run now on the Amber Off, that sure turned that yellow light off, and that yellow light just turned off. So I have these command presets. We talked a little about the triggered one. So if I go to add a command preset, when I click in this box for a name, I get these pre-configured triggers. Right. So when FPPD starts, when FPPD stops, when a playlist starts, when a playlist starts T minus X minutes or seconds, excuse me. So there's some when a sequence starts, do this. When media starts, do that. So you can use these predefined commands such as FPP started, and then run a command like start playlist. And then we can pick the playlist. This Pi does not have playlist created on it, right? But start playlist can play a sequence or a playlist. But on this particular Pi, so I'd probably want to do that on the main Pi, right? Because I want to play the whole show. So main Pi, command presets. I have some others configured in here that we're going to talk about. And I could do like a FPPD started, set like start playlist. And I can pick my Zoom class playlist, repeat it forever. And I always like using the if not running. So if this playlist is not running, then start it. If it's already running, do nothing. Basically what that is. So I can accept those changes. Now, every time FPPD restarts, this guy is going to start that playlist. I'm just going to go ahead and save this real quick. And then if I look at my camera, my trees are not doing anything. My LED panel's not doing anything. And it's interesting that we're right at lunchtime, which is why my lunch lights are running. So that's not part of what I'm doing. But all I did was restart FPPD, go back to status page. And you can see that it automatically started, right? So and you can see my trees and that sequence actually playing. Floodlights are on the Falcon. These other lights on the table are on the Falcon. So the Falcon separate show network's working. The trees are on the Dragon. So the Dragon separate show network's working. And then my LED panels on the tree here. So everything's playing as expected. I can stop that now. It's no longer playing. And if I just do restart FPPD, this will simulate just powering up, or anytime it starts, it should automatically kick that off because I've configured that command preset. So that's the new super convenient way to have a playlist play every time you start FPP. I actually happen to want to come back here, and I'm going to actually get rid of that because I don't want that to actually start every time. So some of the other command presets I've set up, I'm going to demo with the input buttons, is I've got a stop now, a stop effects, and a stop all, which is really a trigger multiple command presets. So a stop all, if I go to take a look at that one, I can actually do multiple presets all at the same time. So I can have a preset that calls multiple presets. Now this stop now, as an example, what it is, it's just the FPP command called stop now, and I'm going to send that out multicast, which means that any FPP device that's able to receive the multicast, it will receive that stop now. So that's end all playlists, any playlists that are playing, etc. So I'm doing multicast, so all devices on my network should stop. Now this is an isolated demo network. It's not really my home network, so my lunch lights won't stop. until we get to 1 o'clock Central, which is about 40 minutes. We're right at the end of this class. And if I edit this effect stop, you see all I'm doing is the command called effect stop and doing the same thing called multicast. So if I have any effects running, it'll stop all those too. And then the stop all will stop all playlists and all effects. That's the gist of the command presets that we have set up and what we're going to talk about. In Xlights, go to my sequencer tab and I'm going to open up sequence, and I've got a test sequence, and of course the computer always runs super slow when you're sharing over Zoom, right? Open sequence, I want to grab this test sequence, should be the one, I think. Before we talk about the sequence, I want to go back to layout for just a second and show you that amber light model as an example. So I got a model, which is just, I happen to use the channel block model type set for one channel. I named him Amber Light, and he's set to channel number 8695. So on my sequencer, if I go to the Amber Light and put on effects or off effects or whatever, then that's going to send that channel 8695, which is configured on this test pi 3. So if I were to go to the sequence and do on effects on that Amber Light, it will automatically trigger. It'll go to that FPP device and trigger that output to the relay. I really want to talk about the new FPP commands timing track. So if I right click up here and say add timing track, right, we can add multiple types of timing tracks, one of which is now called FPP commands. Not prepared to talk about FPP effects, but FPP commands. And I already have one of those added. I dropped in a couple of timing marks, and then I just did like shift double click here to add a label, right? So I can say stop all as an example. That was one of my command presets, but I also have this amber on and amber off. So with it, and you set your timings and you set the name in here for whatever that command preset name is. Now, if I were to save this sequence and play it, then the amber light would come on. You know, after 5 seconds, this sequence has 5 seconds of nothing. You'll all see butterfly, right? 5 seconds of butterfly on everything. And then the amber light will come on for 5 seconds and then go off for 5 seconds, right? Now I do have that kind of staged up on test pi 3. I want to change him back to player mode so I can just play that sequence to show how that command preset can operate. So we'll pick that test sequence. And back to my little live view here real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And then it should start playing. And then after 5 seconds, that amber light should come on. So you're getting like the F16 stuff. This amber light should come on there. It came on 5 seconds because of that command preset in the timing track, and then it goes off, right? And then butterfly will go off at the end of the sequence here in a little bit after 15 seconds. Boom. So that's an example of using the FPP command presets and a sequence. Let's now switch gears and talk about GPIO inputs. I know we're getting kind of what, 20 minutes probably, something like that. Yep, about 20 minutes. Cool, perfect.
Ron, there was a question in chat. It says, does the multicast checkbox use the multi-sync settings?
No, it's actually multicast, right? So it doesn't do with the multi-sync protocol. So it's a network communication. It basically is going to send the FPP command in a multicast network method. So anyone who's listening to that multicast group would process that command. So it has nothing to do with the multi-sync protocol, whether you're master remote or not. So everything can be players. Like you can have 5 different players on your network and send a stop all via multicast, and all 5 of those will stop.
Yep.
Provided that your network supports multicast protocol. Some networks multicast doesn't work as well. Then it just depends on your network gear.
I think the important thing to remember for folks that are newer to this is that multicast and multisync are not interchangeable terms.
Correct. So in my setup with GPIO inputs, I just wanted to also call out in the FPP manual, there's a great section titled GPIO button input in the back of that manual, which has like circuit diagrams, and you can do external resistors. So when you're talking about inputs, basically you want to make sure and set your pin to either a low state or a high state to start out, and you use resistors to do that. So if you're interested in doing GPIO inputs, I would recommend definitely reading that section and making sure you understand that and understanding resistor networks and adding resistors in order to configure. Now, if you're just doing low current stuff and very minor low current, there are some built-in resistors that we're about to talk about. I would say again, like from earlier, be very careful not to apply any more voltage to a GPIO pin than 3.3 volts. So if you're trying to switch with a button for an input from like a 12-volt power source and you send 12 volt to that GPIO pin, you likely just permanently damage your Pi. So this is why I usually recommend to use something like, there are other options, not many, but like the Experience Lights input hats, because they have all of the circuitry and they've accounted for that, and they make sure that through their logic and everything on their hat that they're not going to end up damaging a Pi by sending incorrect or shorting out a pin, GPIO pin. You want to be very careful for that. So you can switch and do with inputs. You can either switch to positive, which means to set the pin high when you push the button, or you can switch to negative, which means to bring the pin low when you push the button. If switching to positive, then you're going to need a pull down resistor type. That means the default state of that pin is going to be pulled down to the negative voltage level, which should be 0, right? So we'll use a pull down resistor if switching to positive power, or if I'm not using a GPIO hat like the input Experience Lights hats, then I prefer to switch to ground, right? That just connect the GPIO to ground, which means you would do a pull up resistor to set the native state of a pin to a high voltage, which in this case is 3.3. And then your button would effectively short to negative, which would then bring that pin from 3.3 down to 0. Okay. When you push a button and you configure GPIO inputs, there's 2 columns in that page we're going to look at in a minute that will configure rising it, or that has a column for rising edge and low edge. What rising edge means is when you switch from a low state to a high state. So if you set your pin low and you switch to a positive voltage, that's going to rise up, right? Because it's going to go from 0 to 3.3 volts. And then falling edge is when you fall down. So you're going from 3.3 down to 0, you're falling down on voltage. That's the trigger events that are going to trigger your commands. Just to note, is the Experience Lights input ats and their in and out boards do switch to positive. So if you're using those devices, you always want to configure a pull down resistor. And then you'll set up your commands in the rising edge column. That way, when you push the button, it's going to rise up and trigger that command. And then when you let go of the button, it's going to fall down. Hopefully that's pretty clear. And let's go ahead and take a look at our GPIO input. So for configuring GPIO inputs, that's going to be under input output setup and then GPIO inputs. On a Raspberry Pi, you have all these pins and GPIO numbers and all. So what do I connect to and how do I connect to it, right? So for the Experience Lights boards, because that's what I'm using here, you can kind of note down here at the bottom, it talks about, you know, number 1 is going to be pin 11 or GPIO 17. Port 2, I'm not using. The keen ID, the people who are paying attention might know why, but if you'll take a look at that GPIO number as an example, that's a special use GPIO number. In my setups, I sometimes use that GPIO number for other things, but it's okay to use it for input if you're not doing those other things. So I'm using 1, 3, 4, 5. So it's going to be GPIO 17, GPIO 27, 22, and 23 is what we're going to configure. So if we're looking here, I come down to GPIO 17. So the way this is laid out is your header pin number. That's pin number 11. That's your physical pin. Then your GPIO number. Then whether or not you're using the internal pull up or pull down resistors. If you're using external resistors like described in the FPP manual, you'll leave that set to none or external. But I'm using the internal resistor, so I'm going to pull down to set that pin to 0. I put a description in here because this represents the A button on my little remote. When I push the A button, what am I going to do? On the rising edge, I'm going to remote start a playlist. So this is a command called remote start playlist. So this test Pi 3 is a remote FPP. I set to player a moment ago for that sequence test. So I'm going to set that back to remote. So even though this is a remote FPP, I'm going to remotely start the playlist on this IP address, which is my main Pi. And I'm going to start the playlist called Zoom class. I'm going to loop that playlist indefinitely until I manually stop it. And I'm only going to call that if it's not running. So if I push this button over and over again, it's not going to restart the playlist, restart the playlist, restart the playlist, restart the playlist. That's why I always use that if not running. So if I push that button and the playlist of Zoom class is already running, it's just going to do nothing. Right, for my button B, GPIO 27, I'm doing a remote trigger command preset. So on a remote device, this IP address, which is my main Pi, I want to trigger the command preset we talked about called stop all. So in this scenario, the A button will start the playlist on the main player. B will do the stop all, which stops all effects and all playlists and everything, right? We already talked about that. For my GPIO 22, my third button, I call it the C on the remote. He's going to trigger command preset locally on this guy called amber on. So on the rising edge, I want to trigger amber on. On the falling edge, I want to trigger amber off. So this makes it act like a momentary switch. Excuse me. Take another drink of water here. 2 hours of talking. So when I push the button and hold it, right, it's going to rise up because the input hat switches to positive. So when I push the button, it's going to rise up. It's going to trigger the amber on preset. When I let go of the button, it's going to fall back down to 0 because of the pull down resistor, and that's going to trigger the amber off. So this functions as a momentary. So as long as I'm holding the button, that light's on. When I let go of it, the light goes off. It functions like a momentary switch. Interesting little deployment, right? All others, when you push a button, it's just going to run a command. So then that command, if it's like start and effect sequence, and that effect sequence is 30 seconds, it's going to run for 30 seconds and be done. Like this fourth option I have set up here where I'm going to do an FSEQ start. So this fourth button is going to run an FSEQ called floods, which just happens to operate those floodlights on my table. I'm going to loop it forever and then run it as a background. So as an effect start. So I have different types of commands that are operating on each of my 4 buttons. Because I'm not actually at home, I can't actually push the buttons, but we can certainly run these commands and take a look at their net effect. Go back to the status page here real quick. We can see that nothing is playing. So if I come back to my Pi 3, and let me just go down here at the bottom, we're just going to run commands, right? So in that one, I had remote playlist start. The remote IP was my main Pi, so we'll pick him. The playlist name is Zoom class. I'm going to loop it, and it was Zoom space class, and only not running. So if I do a run now, that should tell my master Pi to start the playlist. Boom, and it started. And if I look at my camera, it's actually playing. So that would be what occurs when on the test Pi 3, when I push the button. I had a button that would say FSEQ effect start, the floods, loop effect. I don't want to play it in the background. I want to run now. So now my floods in my camera view should be doing something slightly different. And they just alternate colors, right? So that flood effect is working. If I go to Pi 3 and say status control effects, it'll show that effect is running. The floods effect is running. But now if I go to run command and say stop all, and that was a remote trigger command preset on my main Pi, the stop all command preset we set up, and I say run now, that effect should stop, right? Because that did the effect stop on multi-sync, and my main Pi should have stopped that. So that is just running those commands that the buttons are set up since I can't actually push the button. So everything works as expected. And you can see that those lights are no longer on.
Ron, 10-minute warning.
Thank you very much. Yep, about to wrap up. Plugins. So we'll talk a bit about plugins real quick so we can get through that quickly. Main pie. I'm going to content setup, plugin manager. So you have the ability to extend functionality in FPP with plugins. So they can be developed by anyone who's interested in being a developer. It's the responsibility of that plugin developer that developed it to ensure that it's compatibility with the newer version of FPP. So it might be plugins available from like the FPP 3 or 4 days that are just not going to work in FPP 7. So whoever developed the plugin is who's responsible for updating the plugin, make sure it's currently compatible with FPP. There's a plugin repository available that's hosted out in GitHub, and you can access it through the content setup menu in FPP. And it is a way to provide a platform to extend functionality. Right. So one such plugin or content setup plugin manager, you can see all of the plugins that are hosted in that repository. And I'm going to search up here for button, if I can spell it, and big buttons, and I'm going to install. So I'm going to install the big button plugin. It says done. So I went and cloned it and says done and close. So now from my plugin repository, you'll notice this is now green in this top section. It shows you what's installed and what's available. So we installed the big button plugin. The big button plugin adds 2 menu items. Under content setup, there's an option to configure the big buttons. And under status controls, an option to display the big buttons. Let's just go configure big buttons real quick. So this is to configure the big button plugin. By default, you get 1 button. You can edit the little paintbrush up here. You can select a color for the background color for that button. You can name your button. I'm going to say start. And then you would select a command. In this case, I want to say start playlist, right? Start, where's my S's? Start playlist. I'm going to start to play zoom fast. I'm going to repeat it and only start it if it's not running. Done. I spelled start funny, right? Because I held my shift key too long. I want to bring up that you can also have multiple tabs on this big button web page that we're going to show in a little bit. You can have multiple tabs. You can add different tabs at the top for more buttons. If I want to add another button and say this command is going to be stop all or stop now, where I want, right? And I want to name him stop, right? And maybe I want to set his color to more of a red color. And let's go ahead and save those buttons. We talked a little bit in early up about volumes, right? So there's a couple of default commands for volume adjust, volume increase, decrease, or volume set. I'm going to choose volume set. I want, when I push this button, I want the volume to be 70, period, right? And I'm going to say done. So that added that volume. Let's call this volume 70. I don't know, whatever you want to name the button. And you can click and add an icon to your button also. You'll get a whole list of little icons that you can add. So I just did save button. So this is how you configure big buttons. This is not a full class on big buttons, but I have this. I saved a bookmark in Chrome here to automatically take me to the big button page. So these are the buttons I just created, right? Including the capital T and stop, right? That's what I just configured. I'm going to drag that out and then flip back to the main pie here. So this is where you configure the buttons, and then you can go to status control big buttons to actually display that page. And then you can save this as a bookmark. I do this a couple of times and save it as a bookmark on my phone. That way I go with my phone, I have a bookmark, and I can control the show from big buttons, right? From my phone. I'm going to just go back there because I'm going to be switching back and forth. So let's go to the status page here real quick. And we're going to demonstrate that those commands work. So you can see that nothing is currently playing, and I'm going to hit start. And that just started the playlist because that's what I told it to do. I'm going to hit stop. And that just stopped the playlist, which is what I told it to do. My volume is currently set to 18. Maybe we do some volume up, volume downs, whatever, but I want to level set, put the volume back to a known. So I'm going to run volume 70, which is that volume set. And you see, I just set that volume to 70. So I can change the volume to whatever I want. Then every time I hit that button, it's going to run that command, which is set volume to 70, because that's the command I chose. So you can configure all kinds of buttons with multiple tabs to be able to run commands to interact with your show from your phone.
5-minute warning.
All right, and that's kind of the end of like plugins in that demonstration, and now we've got questions. So I'll open it up for questions, and I know we have a break after this. So I'll be hanging out in the room for a little bit too if people have questions that overflow. So if you have any questions, feel free to come off mute or type in chat, either way. Do you have to be connected to the same networks for big buttons? Absolutely, because the big buttons is basically just a web page that's hosted on that FPP device. So you do have to be connected to the network that that FPP device is reachable on. You know, if you were doing something way more advanced, like having a VPN session and your phone is joined to VPN and you do have network access to your FPP over VPN, the buttons would certainly work, yes. First unread message, there's a solution for, oh, thanks, John, that was a lot of helpful. You're welcome, Turtle. Do you have to be connected? Oh, and Dan says there's a solution coming soon. So there is, I will mention briefly that Dan Culp is always very busy in developing and bringing new features and functionality. And he has developed an FPP monitor service. It's a cloud hosted service that you can subscribe to, that on your phone now from your cloud service, you can see all the status of your FPP, and you'll have basic interactive ability to your FPP from anywhere on your phone. It's all by way of a cloud hosted service. And it is my understanding that if you are a PPD club member, the club members now have access to that FPP monitor solution. There's a free tier that I don't know all the details of the tiers, but if you're interested in that, feel free to follow up with Dan on Culp Lights and reach out. And that's a new solution that's coming up.
If you look at my monitor, you can see I got it on my phone. Oops, the phone went dark.
Yeah, I can stop share if you're going to share. Oh, so yeah, Pat's showing up on his phone, holding up in his camera view. That is, yep. So showing the FPP monitor application service. So, any other questions or anything about our content? I know we went through things really quick, designed to just be a primer. Obviously, if you're interested in any of those functions, just feel free to dig in, and we'll all be able to help as much as we can.
I had a question about GPIO inputs.
Sure.
So one of the most common things I think a lot of people do is the Angel Wing station, where you have the multicolored push buttons. I was kind of doing that on my own, and I realized that if you have a little kid or somebody who just mashes all the buttons or pushes all the buttons at once, at some point the sequences stop changing. So I understand that there's like a command presets, and I was just curious if you had a recommendation on a command preset that like kills the list and starts the sequence, or how you have that laid out.
I'm curious, this is Pat, I'm curious as to what version you're running, because we used to have issues like that, but where, multiple playlists got triggered and it got jammed up. But after this, or put it in chat, just let me know, because it sounds like there might be a bug that we can fix. But
so if you're doing like effect,
not like that, it is the command presets for sure. And I am running V7, the latest one. I always try to keep updated.
Okay.
But it's literally me pretending like I'm a 5-year-old hitting all the buttons. At some point, they just stop responding until it plays out.
Correct. So depending on the command that you're actually running, whether you're using command presets or command directly, because the command preset is really just a preset of that command, right? So you can either do the command in here directly, or you can do a command preset, either way. If you're doing an FSQ start or a FX start, I'm not sure what you're using or what you're using for your command. There is not really an option for if not running, right? So if I were to run this FSEQ FX start multiple times, I push that button, but push it, you'll actually see, so we can demonstrate that, right? So if I go to FX and then let's go to command and just say FX start. Do you know if it's FSEQ FX start or FX start that you're doing?
Yeah, I did. I did file sequences because it's separate from my main show.
Yeah, so let's just say I'm gonna run this flood, and I'm gonna run now. And so if I push the button one time, I should get. Oh, I did FX stop, excuse me. Chose the wrong command, of course. And I want to do floods. I don't want to really do that, but let's go ahead and run that now. So you can see over in the background, I've got one instance of that running. But if I go back to command again, and FSEQ start and floods. And so I'm going to simulate multiple button pushes. But you see, every time I push that button, I start getting all of these different instances of those commands running. So I'm running all of these different effects because every time I push a button, it doesn't really have a logic to say if already running, don't do anything, right?
Right.
So that's probably what you're running into is when you start smashing the buttons and there's a certain number of, once you get, a certain number of these in here running that they're going to, kind of just overrun, right? If you're doing like start playlist, right? We talked a little bit about like on the FPP command, like start playlist, and this may be a note, and I don't know if I have the exact answer for you, but if you do a start playlist as your command, and then say that playlist can be an individual sequence, and I can say only if not running. So it would only the if not running just prevents that multiple button smash, right? So if I use start playlist and call that FSEQ individually, and I do if not running, then subsequent button pushes will do nothing. So I'll push it once, it will start. Even if I don't do that and I run this multiple times, you will actually end up with breadcrumbs, and you'll have that playlist started multiple times. Oh, this is not set up as a player, sorry. So that's not actually running anything. Let's see if I can get back to that. And I know we're about to run out of time. Start playlist and floods, why not, right? And then it'll just run now. So that'll start running. And I don't see the breadcrumbs up here. There was an option at one point to show that you got play this after play this after play this after play. So you get that same kind of cascading effect, right? Which is why on like that command, we have that option to if not running, which just means subsequent presses will do nothing, right? So there may be an option to kind of slow it down, or you might have to write a custom script. So part of extensibility is you also, like plugins, you also have script, and you can actually write your own script, or to basically just say like, so then your button will call a script, and the script will say, if this action is already happening, then do nothing. If this action is not happening, then cause the action to happen, right? That's just another option on how to work around that if you do suffer from that multiple button push.
And that was my
makes
question,
sense.
kind of, if there's a way to do a command preset where it tells it stop whatever sequence is running right now and start playing this sequence.
But you could probably actually, just thinking through it, you could probably do like an effect stop, right? Which effect stop will stop all running effects. And then you can say like, I don't want to run now, just accept changes. And then you can probably do like a FSEQ effect start. FSEQ effect start. And then pick my floods. And let's go ahead and loop that. I don't want to run background. And I'm not really going to run a loop that. Let's just go ahead and save that. And then it's call this like effect stop. And then this one like effect start. And then I can add one that would trigger multiple. I'm just thinking on the fly, right? So maybe I add another one that's called trigger multiple command presets, And then I'm going to trigger enough. I haven't saved that yet, so they don't show up in the list. So let me save that, restart. Trigger multiple command presets effect, and then it's pick the effect stop and then the effect start. Accept changes. Let's name that wings, right? Something. So if I do effect start, I'm just going to do this and say run now a bunch of times. If I go back to my effects, we'll see several instances of that running, right? Which is not the behavior we want. So let me go back to command presets. And instead, I'm going to do wings. So wings is going to stop everything and then start the one I want. I did pick the one I want, right? Effect start. Oh yeah, I'm doing the effect start. That's exactly what I want. Yep. So run now. And I should have one instance of it, right? Command preset. Sorry, back to effects. And it is playing, right? So we'll go back to command presets. And it's do wings, and it's just run. I would expect to only find one instance there because each time I run, it is stopping
Killing it,
everything and then
starting it,
starting one.
yeah.
So that might be one method of leveraging the multiple command preset, set of a preset to run multiples and just make sure you have a stop all. And then, to stop all effects and then call it just the effect you want. Yep, that'd be one other method on how to solve that problem.
Perfect,
Thinking on the
thank you.
fly. Look at that. Thinking on the fly. Make it happen. Anyway.